Jerry Brudos' story begins in the quiet suburbs of Oregon in 1939, where he was born into a seemingly ordinary family. Yet, behind doors, his childhood was far from normal. From an early age, Brudos displayed behaviors that set him apart from other children, an intense fascination with women's shoes and clothing that went beyond mere curiosity. While most kids collected toys or sports cards, young Jerry's attention was drawn to objects that represented adult life and desire, hinting at a mind wrestling with unusual impulses. Growing up, his environment played a subtle yet powerful role in shaping his inner world. Strict parenting, combined with feelings of isolation, seemed to amplify his obsession, turning innocent curiosity into something darker. He began collecting shoes secretly, hiding them away in his room, and watching women in ways that made him feel a sense of control he could not achieve in other parts of his life. These early signs were warning signals, small pieces of a puzzle that would later reveal a complex and troubled mind. What makes Brudos' story particularly compelling is the contrast between the ordinary exterior of his world, school, neighborhood, family, and the extraordinary intensity of his private fixations. It is a chilling reminder of how early behaviors can foreshadow patterns that escalate over time, especially when combined with emotional isolation and psychological struggles. In this video, we will explore the life of Jerry Brudos from his formative years, diving into how his early experiences shaped his later actions and the psychology behind his obsessions. If you are fascinated by true crime stories and want to understand the minds behind them, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you do not miss the full story as we uncover the layers of this complex case. As Jerry Brudos moved from childhood into adolescence, the quiet obsessions that had quietly shaped his early years began to grow with an intensity that could not be ignored. What had started as a secret fascination with women's shoes and the delicate textures of lingerie evolved into a deeper and more consuming focus, one that began to weave itself into nearly every aspect of his daily life. While other teenagers were discovering friendships, sports, or hobbies, Brudos' attention was drawn to the objects that, for him, represented a form of power and control that he could not otherwise experience. Shoes, in particular, became symbols, not merely of style or fashion, but of a world he longed to possess and dominate in ways he could not openly express. He began to observe women more closely, noting the way they moved, the way they walked, and the shoes they chose to wear, committing these details to memory in a manner that suggested both admiration and obsession. At first, these acts were subtle, almost imperceptible, a glance here, a lingering look there, but over time, they intensified into more deliberate and calculated behaviors. Brudos began to seek opportunities to obtain the shoes and garments that captured his attention, sometimes borrowing them, sometimes taking them without permission, each act reinforcing the growing association between possession, control, and satisfaction. His room slowly filled with the evidence of his obsession, walls lined with shoes he had collected, each pair carefully catalogued and hidden away, as if safeguarding a secret universe that only he could access. At the same time, his growing interest was not limited to objects alone. It began to extend to the people themselves, creating a bridge between fascination and control. The act of watching became a ritual, a way to study and understand, as if by observing someone, he could gain mastery over the chaos he felt in his own life. His behavior was meticulous, calculated, and carried a quiet intensity that masked the inner turbulence driving it. Friends and family might have noticed his peculiarities, yet the outward appearance of a normal adolescent concealed the depth of his fixation. In these formative years, the combination of isolation, strict upbringing, and an intensifying preoccupation with the personal belongings of women cultivated a mindset where control and observation became inseparable from desire. This period marked a turning point, A moment when Brudos' inner world and outer actions began to align in ways that would later define the trajectory of his life. The seemingly ordinary landscape of suburban Oregon schools, neighborhoods, and quiet streets contrasted sharply with the private intensity of his compulsions, setting the stage for the behaviors that would escalate in complexity and severity over time. The adolescence of Jerry Brudos, therefore, was not merely a stage of growth but a crucible in which his obsessions, fascination with possession, and emerging need for control fused into patterns that would shape the man he was becoming. Every stolen shoe, every hidden glance, and every careful observation reinforced the connection between objects and the power they symbolized for him, laying the foundation for the psychological patterns that would dominate his adult life, and foreshadowing the dark chapters yet to unfold in the story of Jerry Brudos. As Jerry Brudos transitioned into adulthood, the intensity of his obsessions that had been quietly building since childhood began to spill over into actions that went far beyond mere fascination. And the quiet rituals of his adolescence transformed into behaviors that would shock any observer. What had once been the secret collection of shoes and lingering glances from a distance evolved into deliberate acts that allowed him to interact directly with the objects and the women who had long captivated his attention. The thrill of possession became inseparable from the need for control. And gradually, his actions escalated from the taking of shoes to the violation of personal boundaries, moving ever closer to the extremes that would define his criminal trajectory. At first, these behaviors were calculated yet secretive, carried out with the kind of meticulous attention to detail that reflected both his obsession and the desire to avoid detection. Brudos began to intrude into private spaces, selecting victims not at random but guided by the subtle cues that had fascinated him since adolescence: the type of shoes they wore, the way they carried themselves, even the garments they favored. Each act of theft or intrusion was not simply about obtaining the item itself, but about claiming a piece of the world he could not otherwise control. And the tension of acting on these impulses brought a perverse sense of satisfaction. Over time, however, the boundaries that separated obsession from action eroded, and the acts became progressively more audacious and intimate, culminating in violations that went far beyond the theft of belongings. With each escalation, the psychological compulsion deepened. Brudos' behaviors were no longer merely about possession. They became entwined with domination and control over the very essence of his victims. The objects he once admired were now extensions of the women themselves, and by taking and preserving them, he attempted to capture an aspect of the lives that were otherwise inaccessible to him. The thrill of watching, the careful planning, and the act of seizing control all merged into a pattern that escalated toward violence. The quiet neighborhoods of Oregon, once a backdrop for the ordinary rhythm of life, became the stage for these hidden acts. As Brudos maneuvered through everyday settings with a precision that masked the darkness simmering beneath the surface. Eventually, the escalation reached its most extreme form. The obsession that had started with shoes and clothing became inseparable from the acts he committed against the women themselves. The crimes were methodical, often carried out with planning and foresight that reflected both the depth of his compulsion and the intricate nature of his psychological fixation. Each victim became both a participant and a symbol, and the preservation of belongings, shoes, lingerie, personal effects served as tangible reminders of the acts and the control he had exerted. These trophies were not merely keepsakes, but representations of the inner satisfaction derived from fulfilling long-harbored obsessions. A way to maintain a sense of mastery over a world he had long viewed with fascination and longing. Through this progression, the story of Brudos illustrates a chilling evolution from private obsession to outward action, a pathway where psychological fixation, compulsion, and desire for control converge to produce increasingly dangerous behavior. The trajectory of his life, beginning with the secret collection of shoes and moving through calculated violations to acts of violence, underscores how early psychological patterns, left unchecked, can manifest in destructive and tragic ways. It is within this escalation that the full complexity of Brudos' mind emerges, revealing both the depth of his compulsions and the intricate interplay between obsession, action, and the tangible symbols he used to anchor his inner world. Despite the careful planning and secrecy that had allowed Jerry Brudos to carry out his actions for years, the trail of evidence he left behind eventually became impossible to ignore, drawing the attention of law enforcement, who were determined to uncover the truth behind the string of mysterious disappearances and crimes that had plagued the Oregon community. Investigators began to piece together the fragments of a disturbing puzzle, analyzing patterns in the victims' routines, the locations where items were stolen, and the subtle similarities in the methods used to commit the offenses. Each detail, no matter how small, added to a growing picture of a perpetrator whose compulsion had escalated far beyond ordinary boundaries, and forensic science soon emerged as the key tool in connecting the acts that had long seemed isolated and inexplicable. Through meticulous investigation, the police uncovered evidence that directly linked Brudos to the scenes of multiple crimes, including fingerprints, shoe prints, and traces of stolen personal items that had been preserved in his home. The very objects that had once symbolized control and desire for Brudos became his undoing, as forensic analysis revealed connections between his private collections and the victims themselves. Investigators began to understand the psychological patterns that had driven him, recognizing how his compulsions left tangible marks that could no longer remain hidden. The quiet suburban streets that had once served as the backdrop for his secret obsessions now became part of the evidence trail, each step and each object forming a narrative that pointed unmistakably toward him. As the net of evidence tightened, Brudos' carefully constructed world of secrecy began to crumble. Faced with the weight of forensic proof and the relentless work of law enforcement, he eventually confessed to multiple murders, revealing not only the extent of his actions, but also the intricate and troubling thought processes behind them. The confessions offered chilling insight into the mind of a man who had moved from childhood fascination to adult obsession, illustrating the ways in which his compulsions had guided each choice, each act, and each escalation over the years. These revelations were shocking, yet they also provided a sense of closure, linking the stolen shoes, the hidden trinkets, and the carefully preserved objects to the reality of the crimes they represented. The subsequent trial brought these details into the public eye, demonstrating the intersection of obsession, compulsion, and justice. Brudos was convicted for 4 murders, and the courtroom became a stage where the full scope of his actions and their psychological underpinnings were laid bare. Legal proceedings highlighted how evidence, once collected with precision and analyzed with care, could uncover truths that had remained hidden for years. The conviction underscored the critical role of forensic science in not only identifying perpetrators, but also in understanding the behavioral patterns that drive such extreme actions. Brudos' case serves as a striking example of how the very behaviors that define an individual's inner compulsions can simultaneously become the threads that lead to accountability. The stolen items, carefully catalogued and treasured, ultimately became instruments of connection, linking him incontrovertibly to the crimes he committed. Through the combination of methodical investigation, scientific analysis, and careful attention to psychological detail, law enforcement was able to illuminate the darkness that had long surrounded Brudos' actions, bringing both justice for the victims and a window into the complex interplay between obsession, action, and consequence. In tracing the path from early fascination to ultimate capture, the story of Jerry Brudos reveals the inevitable collision between compulsion and accountability, showing how even the most meticulously hidden behaviors can eventually surface under the scrutiny of truth. As the details of Jerry Brudos' crimes emerged through investigation and trial, psychologists and criminal behavior experts began to piece together a profile that explained, at least in part, the extraordinary darkness behind his actions. They identified him as a necrophilic serial offender whose behaviors were deeply intertwined with paraphilic tendencies. A combination of psychological traits that illuminated the compulsions which had guided him from adolescence into adulthood. What distinguished Brudos from other offenders was the precise way in which his obsessions rooted in control, domination, and the fixation on specific objects had shaped not only his actions but also the inner architecture of his mind. These tendencies were not random or impulsive. They were the product of years of repression, isolation, and unresolved trauma that began in childhood and became increasingly complex over time. Experts trace the origins of his compulsions to his early experiences, noting how strict parenting, social isolation, and early exposure to feelings of inadequacy and fear had fused with his growing fascination with women's shoes and clothing to form patterns that would later manifest in extreme behavior. The collection of shoes and personal items was never merely about material possession. It was a symbolic attempt to assert mastery over the aspects of life and relationships that he could not otherwise control. Each stolen object, each carefully preserved article, reflected the inner logic of a mind seeking both understanding and dominion, a psychology in which desire and power were inseparable. The experts emphasized that the fusion of these elements, sexual fixation, compulsive control, and psychological trauma, created a feedback loop that made his actions increasingly dangerous and extreme. The analysis of Brudos' behavior also revealed the critical role of fantasy in the development of his crimes. From a young age, he had constructed private worlds in which his compulsions could play out unchallenged, imagining scenarios in which he could manipulate and dominate while remaining unobserved. These mental rehearsals, combined with real-life actions, gradually blurred the line between imagination and reality, reinforcing his sense of entitlement and intensifying the compulsive behaviors that had already begun in adolescence. Each act of theft, voyeurism, and ultimately violence was informed by this psychological layering, a combination of deeply ingrained fantasies and a desire to impose control on the tangible world around him. Moreover, experts pointed to the way Brudos' childhood trauma, emotional repression, lack of healthy attachments, and early experiences of frustration and anger had intertwined with his sexual and fetishistic tendencies to create a uniquely dangerous profile. His compulsions were not merely isolated acts of deviance, but expressions of a deeply structured psychological landscape in which obsession, control, and unresolved emotional conflict were inseparable. In studying Brudos, psychologists could trace the evolution of a mind in which early unmet needs, fixation on object, and escalating desire for domination coalesced into patterns that culminated in acts of extreme violence. Ultimately, the expert analysis of Jerry Brudos provides a window into the complex interplay of factors that shape the minds of serial offenders. By understanding the origins of his compulsions, the role of obsession in his actions, and the impact of unresolved childhood trauma, we gain insight into not only the mechanics of his crimes, but also the broader implications of how early psychological patterns can influence adult behavior. Brudos' life illustrates a chilling convergence of desire, control, and compulsion, revealing the ways in which unresolved inner turmoil, left unchecked, can manifest in ways that leave a lasting mark on both victims and society, and highlighting the crucial role of psychological insight in both understanding and preventing such tragedies. The case of Jerry Brudos remains one of the most studied and discussed examples in the fields of criminal profiling and forensic psychology, offering a rare and unsettling window into the ways obsession, trauma, and compulsion can converge to produce extreme behavior. His actions, while horrifying, provided investigators and psychologists with crucial insights into the minds of serial offenders, demonstrating how patterns of early fixation and unresolved psychological conflict can escalate into dangerous and violent conduct. By examining the trajectory of his life from a troubled childhood through adolescence marked by increasingly intense obsessions, to the calculated and chilling crimes he ultimately committed, experts were able to refine techniques for profiling individuals whose inner compulsions might otherwise remain hidden, allowing law enforcement to anticipate and prevent similar behaviors in the future. Beyond its impact on forensic science, Brudos' story has also shaped how true crime media approaches the psychology of offenders, by carefully analyzing the connection between his early experiences, psychological tendencies, and eventual criminal acts. Writers, documentary makers, and educators have been able to present narratives that do more than recount the events themselves. They explore the human factors, the warning signs, and the societal responses that surround such cases. The fascination with his story lies not simply in the acts themselves, but in the opportunity to understand the intersection of obsession, compulsion, and the consequences when these factors remain unchecked. Brudos' life and crime serve as both a cautionary tale and a case study, illustrating how critical it is to recognize and address early signs of psychological distress, fetishistic fixation, and violent tendencies before they escalate into irreversible actions. As we reflect on the story of Jerry Brudos, it becomes clear that understanding such cases is not about sensationalizing violence, but about learning from them. It reminds us that human behavior is deeply complex, that childhood experiences and psychological trauma can leave long-lasting imprints, and that the pursuit of justice and knowledge relies on both careful observation and empathetic understanding. By studying cases like Brudos, society gains tools to better prevent, identify, and respond to individuals at risk of harming themselves or others, and we deepen our comprehension of the fragile balance between obsession, morality, and accountability. Thank you for joining us as we explored the life and crimes of Jerry Brudos. If you found this deep dive insightful and want to continue uncovering the psychology behind some of history's most complex criminal cases, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you do not miss our future videos. Your support allows us to keep producing content that not only informs but also encourages reflection on the patterns and lessons hidden within these extraordinary